do you think, he asked, I am handsome or ugly? Are you not too old to be either? It is the only answer. He laughed. In mockery of me, his finger idled from side to side. Well, you are dead, he said, and certainly in danger of expiring a second time. Then you will be gone forever. Goodbye, sweet lad. Your face was more beautiful than your heart. Abruptly, he gave an old man's snigger, unspeakably lewd. Are you content to let me be your guide in Kertnetter? He asked. Do I have a choice? The navel string is already prepared. The portrait of many standing in the water has been commissioned to an artist most esteemed in the circle of my friends, and he will also do a painting of the sails that will catch the breath of evening in the delicate lungs of my son. His voice had taken on the self-indulgence of Hathfertiti's voice, her arch pleasure in hearing the full sounds of herself. Of course I've had so much to do that the work never gets begun. I hear the tomb is a mess and all broken into and shit upon. Poor Many. How, I wonder, are he and old Guano getting along? I laughed. I had rarely heard such mimicry. If once I mocked the gods and fornicated with priests, it was never with ease equal to this. I was beginning to see the stimulations of my condition. To be dead, yet more alive than before, that was as intoxicating as a night when you are ready for anything. Tell me of Kertnetter, I said in a merry tone, as if asking for another drink. The old ravaged face, wrinkled as the shell of a turtle who has walked through fire, now showed a high priest's love of ceremony. Strengthen my breath, he said in his cavernous voice. A transformation came to him with these words, however. The dirt about his body began to look like silver dust, and his right arm was raised toward the heavens. His eyes stayed in solemn contemplation of the ground, yet next he winked at me. I was shocked. He seemed to delight in flinging my thoughts about in all directions. We need, he said, to prepare you. After all, you have forgotten what you know. That is common to the Ka. It keeps a poor memory of our most sacred customs. But his shifts gave me no time to recover my wit. Now he spoke in ceremonious tones again. "O Lord Osiris," he began, and touched his forefingers to his thumbs as though to form two eyes. "I have passed over rivers of fire and through geysers of boiling water. I have entered the dark night of the land of the dead, and gone through the 7 halls and mansions of Sekhet Aru. I have learned the names of the gods at the door to each hall. Hear of the difficulty of this beautiful young man whose Ka would accompany me. How can he obtain the patience to learn the names of the 3 guards at the door to each hall when his memory is infirm? Know the hazards. The doorkeeper at the 4th hall is named Kesef Herasht Keru, and the herald who examines those who die in the night only replies to the sound of Netekaher Kesefatu. And these are but 2 of the 21 names which the Ka of this boy must learn if he is to pass through the gates of Sekhet Aru." My great-grandfather paused, as if to contemplate those names. "Yes," he said in a voice of much resonance, "I, who am Osiris Menenhetet I, have survived your judgment, Lord Osiris. So give ear to my prayer that you spare the Ka of this young man from such fires, for he is no other than the splendid Osiris Menenhetet II, my great-grandson, son of my granddaughter, the Lady Hathfertiti, who was my concubine in life, and kept in carnal knowledge of me through the years of my death. May the scorpions continue to serve me." I was bewildered. The prayer was devout, yet not like any I knew, and I was much confused by the remarks he had just made about my mother. "I could tell you more," he said. "I can say the prayers for repulsing the serpent and spearing the crocodile, I can give you the wings of a hawk, so you may fly above your foes, or show you how to drink the ale in the body of the god Ptah. I can reveal the gates to the field of reeds, and teach you to come forth from the fishing net. Yes, I will do all this, if I am your guide. I was drowsy before the need to sleep. That ancient subterranean voice invoked so many names. I might mock those names, but to call upon such a host in so short a time left me weak. Now I realized that the strength of my ka seemed as short-lived as the confidence of a child to stay on its feet when first it learns to walk. I had an impulse to prostrate myself before him. Yet he was never more repulsive. I could dine in every royal garden of the Nile with the tales I might tell if I survived this night. He was ludicrous in the extreme, this dusty old man with his deep, cold voice, lonely as the loon, and yet imbued with confidence. Figure the absurdity of his speech when he broke wind from his buttocks with every god he named, a cacophony of claps, pips, pops, poops, bellows, and on-booming farts, and all, by the look of his expression, of the most delicious obscenity. He gave a little aristocratic greeting of his wrist to each monster, divinity, or ogre he invoked, as though he contained carnal knowledge of them all, and so could drop salutes of thunder from the ramparts of his old canal. The tomb stank, once from the litter of all those spoiled wrappings, and now from the storm of his speech with all the sulphurs of his breath and the break-winds of his body. "Do you know anything that is true of my life?" he asked. I replied, "You tortured prisoners, prayed to the filthiest gods, and feasted on substances no one could tolerate." "I prayed to gods whose powers were so fearsome that others shunned their works, and ate many a forbidden substance. The secrets of the universe are there. Do you think I became overseer of the Lord God Osiris by daring too little?" "I have no trust," I said, "in the idea that you are the overseer of Osiris. I witness no superiority to your knowledge." But the remark was too bold. I shivered even as I spoke. He smiled, as if our conversation had passed wholly into his domain. "What do you witness?" he remarked. "You do not know the story of Osiris. You do not even remember what you were taught by the priests." I nodded unhappily. I did not. I could think of tales I had been told in my childhood about Isis and Osiris and other of those gods from whom we all began, but now, as if the depths of such stories were as lost and far apart from me as the wrappings of my organs in their canopic jars, I sighed, and felt as hollow within as a cave. While I could not say why I thought this was so, it seemed to me as if nothing could be more important than to know these gods well, as if, indeed, they could fill all that was empty in my marrow, and so serve as true guides to the treacheries I would yet have to face in the land of the dead. For now I remembered an old saying, "Death is more treacherous than life." When Menenhetet, however, nodded back at me in mockery of my need, I felt obliged, in some last rally of my pride, to speak my most determined criticism. "I cannot believe you are an emissary of Osiris," I told him. "Your stench would repel the nostrils of the god." Menenhetet I gave a sad smile. "I have the power to offer any smell you desire." And in the silence that followed, he was clean as perfume and sweet as grass. I bowed my head. Osiris, most beautiful of the gods, must have concern for me if his overseer was Menenhetet I. What an appeal to my vanity was such a thought. Therefore, I asked my great-grandfather if he would tell the story of Osiris and of all the gods who lived at the beginning of our land. And to prove I was sincere, I moved across to sit by him. He smiled, but did not welcome me in any other way. Instead, he reached into the fold of his long dusty skirt and, one by one, removed a number of scorpions, each of which he held in turn with a practiced and tender hand. One scorpion he placed upon the lid of each eye, two on the gates of his nostrils, one for each of his ears, and he laid the last scorpion on his lower lip, 7 scorpions for the 7 orifices of his head. Then he gave one more nod, grave as a stone. "In the beginning," he said, "before our earth was here, and the gods were not born, before there was a river or a land of the dead, and you could see no sky, it was still true that Amun the Hidden rested within his invisible splendor." Here Menenhetet raised a hand, as if to remind me of the elegant gesture the high priest would use in the temple when I was a child. "Yes, it is from Amun that we know our beginning. He withdrew from the Hidden to come forth as Temu, and it was Temu who made the first sound. That was a cry for light." The solemnity of the priests, by whom I had been instructed in my childhood, was upon me, and my limbs had no power. "The cry of Temu," Menenhetet said, "quivered across the body of his wife, who was Nut, and she became our celestial waters. Temu spoke in so great a voice that the first wave stirred in her, and these celestial waters brought forth the light. So was Ra born out of the first wave of the waters. Out of the great calm of the celestial waters was born the fiery wave of Ra, and he lifted himself into the heaven, and became the sun even as Temu disappeared back into the body of his wife, and was Amun again." Menenhetet exhaled his breath. "That is the beginning," he said. I was feeling the same respect I used to know when priests spoke of the first sound and the first light. "I will listen," I told him. So soon as I uttered these words, however, he removed the scorpions, replaced them in the fold of the skirt from which he had brought them forth, and began to talk in another tone of voice, as if the solemnity of what was said in the land of dead could not endure more than 1 part in 7 against our most solemn hours in life. For now, with hardly a warning, he became most disrespectful of the gods, even scandalous in what he had to say, as if they were all his brothers in a large and disreputable family. With all I had heard of his capacity for sacrilege, I could still not believe how obscene the story of Osiris soon became. Nor was I prepared for how long it would take. Before we were done, I would be obliged to know them well. 2. The Book of the Gods. 1. Like an old man whose throat is a pot of phlegm, Menenhetet began to cackle at these foul jokes awaiting us. "Put a divine lady before Ra," he said, "or a slippery old sow. It was all equal to him. He liked them all. His only problem was to find a wife cool enough to bear his heat. So he settled on the goddess of the sky." Menenhetet began to choke in laughter once more. "Ra could change the shape of his prick to any of the 42 animals, ram, ox, hippo, lion, just pick the beast. But he once made the mistake of telling Nut that he did not like to make love to a cow. So she chose to live in the body of one. It is always that way with marriage." He nodded. "Whenever she could, Nut rushed down to the mud baths with Geb. What a wallow! Revenge is never so dear to a woman as when her perfidies go right up her husband's nose. Ra was so infuriated that for the next 5 nights, 5 children were put into her womb. Ra and Jo were on her so constantly that the earth steamed and the sky was covered with fog." Now Menenhetet ceased talking. A sadness came upon his face, as if the matters of which he could next speak could not be called amusing. "Now, whether," he said, "these 5 offspring were fathered by Ra, whose children they were immediately declared to be, or belonged to Geb, will never be known, but by one or the other, Nut gave birth in the first hour to Osiris, and in the second, Horus was delivered. On the third, Set burst out of his mother's side, thereby creating a rent in the sky through which lightning could strike. Isis came out in a dew of moisture, and Nephthys, born last, was given the secret name of Victory, for she was the most beautiful. She would yet marry her brother Set, even as Isis was wed to Osiris, although it is said of Isis and Osiris that they were already in love with one another within the womb. Under such circumstances, how can one ask who was half-sister and brother? Here his voice came so close to my ear that I did not know any longer how his knowledge was imparted. When I closed my eyes, the story even seemed to belong for a little while to me, and indeed, I could hear the voice of Ra. "I look upon my children," he shouted, "and do not know if they are mine, or crawling things from the caverns of Geb. I am damaged even as I damn them, for I cannot say whether I curse them unfairly or not enough." The three brothers, Horus, Osiris, and Set, and the sisters Isis and Nephthys, lived in a house full of bad omens. Even as children they played at treachery and dreamed of murder. The curse of Ra passed into the marriage of Isis and Osiris, and the marriage of Set and Nephthys. Yet what a difference between them! Isis loved Osiris, and found him more attractive than herself, whereas Nephthys was miserable. Set's body scorched her belly. Under the fire of his temper, she felt the stones of the desert. "How can my name be Victory," asked Nephthys, "if my womb burns when he enters me?" But Osiris was as cool as the shade of an oasis. His fingers were tender when he passed the dish. There came a night when Nephthys betrayed her husband with Osiris. Now Set had a plant which bloomed each night on his return, yet this evening the plant was limp. "Lift your face," said Set, "for I am here." In response, the plant fell dead. Now Set knew that Nephthys was with Osiris, and when she came back he could see that the night with his brother had been more beautiful to her than any hour with him. Then Nephthys confessed that she had conceived, but with a joy in her voice he never heard before. The hatred of Set began to grow upon this shame. He fornicated with Nephthys every night, and the thought of Osiris whipped his hips to a gallop. He worked so hard to crush the creation in her belly that the mother began to feel loathing for what she carried. In the hour of birth, Nephthys wept and could not look at the baby's face. Conceived in beauty, the creature came out as misshapen as the depredations of her womb. A face of mean ferocity was presented, and it gave off a low odor. Anubis, the god with the head of a jackal, had been born. Nephthys carried this Anubis to the desert and exposed him, but her sister Isis was determined that the infant should not be lost. If Anubis was the proof of her husband's most treacherous hour, still Isis knew that the infant should not be lost. Menenhetet now said aloud, "Whoever is born out of treachery must not be slain against his will." "Why would that be true?" I asked. "Because demons are conceived when people die in rage." I did not like what he said. In what manner had my own end come? To hide my uneasiness, I told him, "You are reputed to have killed every slave who would not work." "That was in the gold mines, and I did not kill them. They died of overwork. Besides, I never said I did not wish to deliver demons," replied Menenhetet I, and shivered. Like the sound of water readying to boil were the whispers of his voice. Yet I still saw all he had to tell, and most clearly. So I knew that Isis, hunting with dogs offered the scent of linen stained with the birth, soon found the baby. Menenhetet I sniffed at his finger, and a scent of sour blood passed over to me. He merely smiled at this passing display of his powers. "Isis," he said, "trained the child to be her guard. Now Anubis is the jackal who holds the scales of judgment. Before him, the dead must appear. Have you forgotten that as well?" When I made no sign, he nodded. "In one pan is placed the dead man's heart, on the other is laid the feather of truth, and woe to the dead if the scales do not balance. Anubis can judge such things. His first day had no more promise of long life than is given to a feather. You may come before Anubis yet." Menenhetet smiled, but when I offered nothing, he merely shrugged and took up his account again. "Contemplate the murderous rage of Set," he said. "His wife's bastard was still alive. Set swore a vengeance that would never weaken no matter how many years he had to wait, and they were many. For Osiris was not only the first king of Egypt, but the greatest. He had taught us how to grow wheat and make beer from barley, how to cultivate corn, raise good grapes, and ferment good wine. He even taught us how to ferment the fermentation and find the 7 powers and spirits of the soul in a cup of colubi. But then Osiris began to travel over the very green to pass on this knowledge to more ignorant lands, and it proved foolhardy. He was so worshipped at every court that by the time of his return to Egypt he had become too aware of his beauty. In the first month of his homecoming, Set invited him to a great feast and excited the vanity of Osiris by telling him of a magnificent chest that he had built to fit the body of the god closest to Temu. Set called for the chest to be brought and commanded the 72 gods of his court to lay within it one by one. The box fit none of them, nor did it match the proportions of Set. At last it became the turn of Osiris, and he was a perfect fit. "You are so beautiful," said Set, as his brother lay down. Then he slammed the cover. 7 of his warriors sealed it with molten metal. Now they carried the chest to the Nile and lay it on the water. It floated away on an afternoon when the sun was in the sign of the scorpion, and Osiris was gone. When Isis heard of this, she let out a cry that became part of the shriek men utter when they behold their own wound, and she began to search for the coffin in the marshes of the delta and in the swamps. And I, as if suffering an equal blow, now moved and sat with the side of my face against the cool wood of poor Many's burial case. Poor Many indeed. Who but myself? As Menenhetet I continued to tell his story, I think I must have crawled out along a branch of sleep and fallen from there into another sleep, since I only came back into the passage of his voice after the coffin of Osiris had floated all the way down the waters of the Nile and was out at sea on a voyage to Byblos by the shores of Lebanon. There I heard the smack of the last wave as the box was lifted by a swell into the branches of a little evergreen growing out of the rocks on the beach. Yet that poor shrub, twisted by every wind, began to thrive as soon as Osiris came to it, and its trunk grew right around the coffin and rose to prodigious height until the king of Byblos saw it, and thereupon had the tree cut down and made into the central pillar of his new palace. To this shore came Isis, led by her 7 scorpions, and when she arrived at the court of Byblos, and the queen received her, Isis smelled of a fragrance sweeter than any garden. To this queen, Astarte, the first measure of rank was superb appearance. She only wished those as lovely as herself to come near. Therefore she welcomed Isis. Indeed, they cherished each other so tenderly that Isis could even ask the queen to beg the king to cut down the pillar and thereby free her husband from the coffin. It was a monumental request. The greatest room in Byblos would be destroyed. From the day, however, that he had felled the tree to build the chamber, this king, Melkarth, had become secretly fearful of the silence in his palace, so he agreed. When the chest was opened, however, Osiris was found in a dreadful state. His face was covered by worms. Isis let out a cry of lamentation, and so loud was the clamor of her voice that the youngest child of Melkarth died in fright. Blood poured from his ears. The death was not wholly lamentable to the king. He was far from convinced of the paternity of this son, for he had been stricken with impotence as soon as the magnificent tree was down. Now he felt desire for his wife come back, and he took the queen to his rooms and tried to be happy, but could not. He feared to enjoy himself so soon after such a death. It might cost another. But then Melkarth realized that he trusted none of his sons, and was therefore ready on Isis' departure to lend her the oldest of his boys to serve as crew. Her ship had hardly gone from sight of land before ministrations were begun over the body in the coffin. Loosing the 7 scorpions from the hem of her skirt, she instructed them to devour the worms that lived on the face and limbs of Osiris. The scorpions worked with all the speed of the wind in the sails, and were as round as pigeons' eggs before evening. Now Isis crushed these sluggish bodies to make an unguent, and thereby cast off all protections such scorpions could provide. Indeed, even as she killed them, she knew they would send a message to their brothers, "Beware of Isis." Yet she was determined to repair the beauty of Osiris. The oil for such a restoration could be found only in the bellies of these scorpions full of worms. So she rubbed this unguent upon her legs and belly. Having stripped her skirt for this purpose, she thereby aroused the poor prince of Byblos until his seed was on the deck. This she also added to her skin, for the prince was favored with the features of his mother, and then washed Osiris in the salve by laying her body upon her dead husband, and by this so excited the return of his 7 scattered lights that he came back from all the swamps, harbors, mountains, and seas of his death to the home of his body. In this hour, young again and beautiful, lying on his back, he discharged his seed up into Isis, and it was the first time a goddess ever dared to sit upon a god. The prince of Byblos, spying on this copulation, was struck with such a look of malevolence from Isis that he died on the spot and fell into the sea, and Horus, the other brother of Osiris, also died at that instant, breaking his back in a fall from a horse. Whereupon Horus, the child of Isis and Osiris, was conceived in the same moment, but he came out with a weakness in his legs. Since gods do not often die, Horus the newborn was a transformation of Horus the brother, and it is certain the child grew quickly and was a full-grown man in 14 years. But they were to be hard years. Iris knew that Ra and Set were waiting for her. When she came back to Egypt, Isis looked therefore to hide the chest containing her husband. Yet it was not easy to find a place, for the coffin had to rest where the direct rays of Ra could fall upon it. The sun could only send a curse upon gods who tried to hide from him. Osiris would be safe from Ra's wrath if his coffin were not buried. Therefore Isis chose a shallow lake in the swamps of the delta, and fixed the box with stones so that it would not float away from the papyrus plants surrounding it. Yet, with the lid removed, Osiris could lay open to Ra for his blessing. Still, Isis felt far from secure. Since Ra could always lay a curse when he went behind a cloud, she had had at considerable cost to make her peace with the scorpions. She took a vow to protect their safety for all their lives to come. It was necessary. She had need of them. Scorpions were that rare species for whom the rays of the sun are an irritant. So when the sun hid itself, they were quick to come out of the ground and wait by the coffin of Osiris. All through the day, therefore, whether in sun or by vigilance of the scorpions in the gloom, the body of Osiris was guarded. And at night, in the darkest hour of the night when Ra wandered through the underworld, in that wholly dark hour when the scorpions began to sleep, then Isis was confident Set could not find his brother in such a swamp. Besides, Anubis reigned in this hour of greatest darkness, and he was loyal to Isis, which is to say, true so long as he could be. The powers of Anubis might be steadfast in the dark, but loyalty paled just before the dawn when he knew the hour of the jackal and would wander off. Now for months Set had slept by day and ridden by night, but to no purpose until he convinced Ra to ask the moon to travel for all of one night into the dawn. So Set obtained a few more hours of moonlight, but he still had to find the swamp where his brother was hidden. Therefore he called upon every memory. That was equal to saying his pride had to writhe again in all the shame of the cuckold. Yet if he was obliged to think of Nephthys with Osiris, it was but a step from there to see Osiris in the embrace of Isis, and that made it possible for Set to enter the thoughts of Isis. So on this night, when the sun was down, Set offered his breath to the evening sky and to the dark ridges of the earth, his mother and father no less, and turned slowly until his thoughts could look into Isis, where she lived in the town of Buto. Motionless as a hunter, Set waited until the moment when the depth of early night was lit by the moon rising over the swamp. Then, into his mind, at the moment it came into Isis' mind, arrived the image of the grove where Osiris was hidden. Set spurred his horse and charged up and down the swamp in search of that view, until, in a fever of sweat, laved in his own coating of mud, there in the last of the moonlight in the hour of the jackal, he found the open chest unguarded, the scorpions sleeping, and Anubis gone. In this pale hour before dawn, Set lifted his sword and butchered the dead body of his brother, hacking free the heart, the backbone, and the neck, the head and legs and arms, Osiris' stomach, his intestines, his chest, his liver, even his gallbladder, his buttocks. Set would certainly have amputated the genitals if he had not stopped to make a count, and discovered he had 14 pieces already, a number twice 7. Thereby a formidable doubling of bad luck to his enemies. But then his frustration was great because he could not mutilate his brother further, and his blood raged until he raised his sword and chopped off his own thumb and left it in the mouth of Osiris. With his horse he carried the coffin and the 14 pieces back to camp, then sent his men to deliver the chest to the camp of Isis. Now he got ready to travel up the Nile. Employing a galley of the most powerful oarsmen in the kingdom, his boat would sail, he knew, and be rowed faster than Isis could ever follow. And on this journey he would bury the parts of Osiris in different places. But first, in all the vigors of his victory, he chose to go down the separate mouths of the delta, and leave the lower limbs at Bubastis and Busiris, which is why the hieroglyph of the letter B is the drawing of a leg, and he even left one arm at Balaman for good measure, the other at Buto, where Isis lived, stopping there long enough to rape her favorite handmaiden and strew 2 more pieces in the swamp. Isis was helpless in this hour. Set then left parts of Osiris at Athribis and Heliopolis, and the head at Memphi, gave burial to one section of the body at Fayum, then further up the Nile to Siut, Abydos, and Dendera, and feeling safe at last, trusted his men to row the long distance with the last piece up the river to Yeb. And if these men had walked, it would have taken 30 days and 30 days again, but they stopped to celebrate, and so it took twice as long. Now Isis lost all desire to move from her bed. Her breast had no milk. Near to human was Isis in the depth of her unhappiness. Set had overcome her magic. Certainly her most intimate forces gave no intimation of return. In this sad time, her thoughts drew tears whose fall gave birth to rain, a last gift of the sweet powers in the body of Osiris, scattered now from the marshes of the delta to the waters of the first cataract. I do not know if it was this unfamiliar sound of rain in our Egyptian air, but a haze drifted over my thoughts, and I could see these gods no longer. It was startling to recognize Menenhetet as he looked at me out of the blazing white of his eyes. "We come," he said, "to the activities of Ma'at. Without her, all might be lost for Isis." 2. "Yes," he said, "Ma'at is so devoted to the smallest measure of balance that she chose a feather for her face. To think that she is the daughter of Ra." Again I was confounded by the phenomenon of his laughter. It was as if the greed of the worst beggars passed through him, some sewage of mean human tide. Yet he seemed altogether oblivious to the blow this gave his dignity. "Yes," said Menenhetet, "Ma'at is the most innocuous of Ra's fornications. In fact, she was conceived by a little bird who, after all the quick and timid trips of her life, became for once intoxicated by the warmth of the air. Soaring on a current, this downy fluff rose to the arms of Ra, up in a trance, and immediately expired. What a copulation! The mother was roasted to a crisp, and the child drifted down to us as a feather, a genius of balance between heartfelt attraction and clear immolation." He gave another disturbing laugh. "Now that same feather is used by Anubis to weigh the moral worth of the heart of each dead person." He shrugged again. "Of all of his children, Ma'at is the only one who has no guts to lose, so she is fearless. She was the only divinity brave enough to scold Ra about his favors to Set, and did no less than tell her father, "It is dangerous to protect a victor from the curses of those he defeated. Such a god will prosper too easily, and the world will tip." "Do not speak of balance," Ra told her. "I ride in a golden ship by day, but am obliged to travel through the Duat by dark and give battle to the serpent. If I ever lose, the world will not see my light again." Menenhetet gave vent to his laugh. "I can assure you, Ma'at was not about to tell Ra that the perils of the serpent were small." And again, as if the story pulled on me like a stream of passing spirits, the sights in my mind began to stir. I could see that Ra no longer fought alone, and many gods and goddesses were by his side to trap the serpent. Indeed, Ra had to do no more than chop Apep into pieces. All the same, the labor made him breathe heavily. Ra was growing old. Ma'at, rebuked by her father, began to watch the habits of his pilot fish. For these two creatures, named Abtu and Ant, would serve as his eyes when it came to navigating the perils of the Duat. Each night, swimming to either side of Ra's boat, they guided the entourage past fires, boiling pits, and stench. By day, however, the fish, justifiably fatigued, chose to become two short pieces of rope, and they would sun themselves on the banks of the Nile. There they basked, 2 bites of bleached hemp, so short that no passing fisherman would think of splicing them to a larger rope. Ma'at, now traveling in her natural condition, a feather in the wind, soared along the riverbank until she passed over the pilot fish. Hovering in place, she succeeded in putting Abtu and Ant into shadow. Deprived of the light of Ra, their ability to reason was confused, and so they quit the shore for the water, but the shadow of a serpent now flickered on the surface. They were not aware it was the feather twisting its supple spine above the river to cast patches of shade below. So they chased the shadow of that serpent down the current until Ma'at led them to the pelvis of Osiris stuffed in the stump of an uprooted palm, a place that Ma'at knew well. She had been present, as the spirit of balance, when Set on the last stroke cut off his own thumb instead. Now Abtu leapt on the phallus of Osiris, bit it off, choked it down, and danced in frenzy through the water. His skin was luminous. He felt composed of light. A terror. Where to hide? In panic, both fish rushed to the shore to reassume their existence as pieces of dull hemp. Yet when Abtu turned back into a rope, he was whiter than the moon, and Ant had to cover him with mud until it was time to swim off to the Duat once more. In the dark, however, he gleamed. He would call attention to them all. In fury, Ra lifted him from the water and swallowed him. Ant was left to serve as the pilot, but since he could not keep the boat off the rocks on his blind side, the bark shuddered and scraped from every blow, and the phallus of Osiris sticking in his stomach, Ra soon grew ill. The balance shifted. Since the god's member proved indigestible, Ra began to feel most uncomfortable, and allowed the sky to cloud. Isis stirred in her bed and listened to the gulls. Their cawing went on through gray and hazy days. Other birds came to tell how the noble horse on which Set hunted in the swamp had shied from a fallen tree and broke his leg. The good luck of Set might have shattered. Isis dared to remember the hour when she and Osiris gave conception to Horus. Even as the prince of Byblos fell backward once more into the sea, so did a message come from the Ka of Osiris. Iris must arm herself with the secret name of Ra. She began to listen to the gossip of the gods. Now she heard that Ra was old, and his bones had changed from gold to silver as his limbs grew stiff. He dribbled when he spoke. His 7 emissions fell constantly to the earth, and the paths were covered with his earwax and his sweat, his urine, his turd, his snot, his semen, and saliva. Isis contemplated how to use these leavings. The full bowel of the sun certainly reeked of wealth. Yet how could she know which monsters of the sulphurous night might also be set free? That was power too much. Isis needed the secret name no more. Why conclude that Ra excreted his secret name each day? So too did she avoid sweat. In his perspiration might be the honor of his name, but such sweat also gave off the odor of every animal he became while making love, and their secret names, an abundance and a confusion. Nor did she think to look for his seed. The secret names of future sons and daughters would be in that seed, but not his own. So did she also pass over the snot and the earwax. Ra hardly listened to what others said, so in his earwax was much stupidity, while the nose was a poor place to conceal the name when every wind would sniff it out. Only urine and saliva were left, a choice of the sour waters of his blood or the well of his mouth. Each had a clear attachment to the name. Like a great river that carries off many a secret from the land was Ra's urine, but those waters went back to the celestial waters. Nut would certainly be displeased if Isis tried to steal a secret name from her. Therefore Isis chose saliva. It was the spirit of Ra's speech. At the center of his speech must be the name. Therefore she took up moist dust near a spot where the old god walking on his path had drooled, and she worked this moist dust into clay, and added to it an old powder made of the semen of Set, which she had kept from the skirt of the handmaiden Set had raped. There could be no better way to fortify a poison than to mix the leavings of one's enemies. So Isis shaped this mortar from the spit of Ra and the semen of Set, and molded it into the form of a snake, and anointed its fangs, which came from the cuttings of her fingernails, with the poison of scorpions. Then Isis said to these fangs, "Go out, discover in your enemy what is most different from yourself. Attack him there. Loose your sting." The venom of Isis' heart flowed from her eye, and every carnal memory of Ra was in it. For with no innocence had she studied the 7 varieties of his emission. His scent had been left on her. Despite her adoration of Osiris, which was like the tenderness of the sky as evening fell on the oasis and animals stood next to one another, Isis could never prevent one outrageous desire. It was the thrill to her belly at the sight of Ra. So she had indulged one secret hour with her father. How the death of Osiris brought back the burden of her old deception. She had never told her husband, and Osiris therefore had believed himself too well beloved. Knowing too little of the powers of other gods, he had entered Set's coffin too carelessly. To her own rage at Ra was added, therefore, the turmoil of her own deception. With what a spell did Isis leave the serpent on the path! Ra passed through the cool fields of heaven, pouting and dribbling, as he took his short walk in the dawn. On this route had Isis set her snake. As the old god approached, his belly still churning on the indigestible phallus, the snake leaped through the distance within itself from the inert clay to the vital curse, and lanced its fang into the god. And the poison said, "Burn, Ra, as flame licks at your loins. Freeze in the chill of your golden eye as the light leaves. A poison has been made that will find your last extremity." And the sun god felt the presence of all he was not. It crept across him, and his limbs began to struggle, and heat became his torture. He staggered, and his will had fear of all that was strange in his flesh. His skin lost its hue, and he was pale as platinum, pale as the silver of his bones. The old age of Ra turned in his mouth, and his lips made him spit on the earth. The poison came into his flesh, even as the Nile spreads over the fields. "What has stung me?" he cried out. "It is something I do not know and have never made." And he gave the great cry of bewilderment all men have since uttered to themselves at the moment death is on them. "Come here, gods and goddesses," he cried out, "all you who were formed from me." The air altered. Light and dark flowed, colors engulfed other colors. Gods and goddesses manifested themselves from the 4 pillars of the sky, up from the river, and across from the winds of the desert. The waters of the Duat boiled. Ra said, "At dawn I was passing through the kingdom of Egypt, for I wanted to see what I had made, and a serpent bit me. I feel colder than water, and more inflamed than the fire. My legs sweat, my body shakes, my eyes are weak. Water pours from my face as in the time of flood. Agonies have entered." In the pall that followed, dark as the blood that dries on sand after a war has passed, Isis spoke. For that first instant, the gods snickered. They all knew of Isis' humiliation by Set. There was, however, no uncertainty in her tone. "Great Ra," she said, "you have been poisoned by an art devoted to your death." "I cannot die," said Ra. "I am the first, and the son of the first." "You will die," said Isis, "unless you reveal your secret name. He who is able to reveal his name will live." "I will not tell my secret name," said Ra. "If I am gone, the earth bursts, and the heavens are lost with the earth. For I have created the heavens, and the secret of the horizon." She came forward. Step by step, she entered the aura of Ra. Now she whispered into his ear. Her voice quivered through his flesh. He tried to stand to his full height, but was bent over in wretchedness. "I cannot die," said Ra. "My father gave a secret name in fire. My mother annealed it in the waters. They hid my name when I was born. No word can have power over me so long as my name remains unknown." "The poison," said Isis, "will reach to the last corner of your flesh. The semen of Set is in that poison, and he knows no fear at searching you." "I will reveal my secret name to all," said Ra. A cry came up from the gods, then a silence. But Isis knew that Ra would lie. In the past, his eyes would always show his earnest heart when he spoke with no truth. "My names," said Ra, his mouth so tight with pain that his jaw could hardly move. "My names are without end. My forms are the form of all things. Every god has his existence in me." "Do not die, great Ra," cried the gods. But they did not know if they wished for his life or his death. They did not know what they desired. A fearful day for the gods. "My name," shouted Ra, "is Maker of Heaven and Earth. I am he who links the mountains together. I am he who caused the great flood. I am he who made the joys of love. I am he who made the horizon. I am the being who opens his eyes and light comes. I am the being who closes his eyes and it is dark. I am he whom the gods know not." He stumbled and almost fell. Isis said, "There is no mention of the secret name. Soon you will be consumed by the poison. Declare the name." As she spoke, the gods gave a murmur. She was more splendid than Ra. Side by side they stood together, and she was more splendid. "I am he who creates the fire of life," said Ra. "I am he who is Khepera in the morning, Ra at noon, and Temu in the evening. I am he who—" His voice failed. Poison was climbing the cataracts of his blood, and the seas were his mind on fire. The glare of heat was in all of existence. Consumed by heat, he tore off his clothing. "Search me!" Ra cried out. In view of the gods, Isis came forward, took off her robes, and lay upon him. From within his belly the phallus of Osiris gave life to the stick of his old loins, and he came forth into Isis with the secret name, and all of the semen of Set that he had swallowed with the poison, and this act loosed the most terrible lightning ever seen in the skies of Egypt. Thus was Set first made Lord of lightning and thunder. And so did Ra pass his secret name over into the belly of Isis. It entered on a quiet voice that told her, "Temu is one, the celestial waters are two, and Ra, child of Temu and Nut, is three. So his secret name is three. Roar, Isis, like a lion, that we may hear the sound of R in all the tongues. For the roar of the sun is the light of earth, and the air of Ra shall be as the light of the mind, which is death. Hail, Osiris, Lord of the land of the dead. Rise, Isis, who holds the secret name of Ra.